On a crisp September morning in the year 1066, the fields of Yorkshire stood silent, unaware they were about to host the end of an era. Under the bright English sky, the fate of nations collided. Warriors from across the North Sea clashed with the proud shield walls of England in a battle so fierce and so unexpected that it crushed. In just a single day, the Vikings' dream of conquest. This was more than just a struggle for land. It was the collision of two worlds, the fading twilight of the Norse raiders and the rising dawn of medieval kingship. The sea that September morning was calm, but the horizon carried menace. Out of the gray mist rose a forest of sails, ghostly and endless, blotting out the rising sun. At the prows of those longships were carved beasts of Norse legend, snarling dragons, twisting serpents and ravens with watchful eyes. They did not just sail toward England, they glared at its shore, hungry for dominance. This was no ordinary raid, it was an invasion. At the head of this armada stood Harald Hardrada, King of Norway, his banner, the fearsome land waster, whipped and snapped in the wind. It was a banner soaked in history, one that had flown over battlefields from the walls of Constantinople to the frozen rivers of the Rus. Hardrada was more than a king. He was a man carved by decades of violence, hardened in the fire of countless wars. Long before this campaign, Hardrada had fought as part of the Byzantine Varangian Guard, one of the most elite fighting forces of the medieval world. He returned from those years with not only a fortune in gold, but also a mind sharpened by strategy, deception, and relentless combat. Now he brought that experience to England's shores. At his side sat an ally whose motivations were far darker and far more personal. Tostig Godwinson, the exiled Earl of Northumbria and younger brother of England's King Harold Godwinson. Tostig was no loyal follower of Norway. His heart burned with revenge. Cast out by his own people and betrayed by his brother. He saw in Hardrada's invasion a perfect vessel for his rage. He wanted his honor back, his lands back. And above all, he wanted to wound his brother in the deepest way possible. Together, they commanded a fleet of more than 300 longships. Some chroniclers whisper the number was closer to 350. On board were perhaps 8,000 men warriors clad in mail, and leather archers carrying bundles of arrows, and hardened housecarls wielding the terrifying two-handed Dane axe. Their oars bit into the waves in perfect rhythm, rising and falling like a great war drum echoing across the sea. When they entered the Humber, the invaders moved with frightening precision. They slipped into England's rivers and waterways as though they had sailed them all their lives. Villages along the banks burned in their wake. Smoke curled into the sky, blotting out the blue and filling the air with the bitter stench of fire. The Norse army pressed inland like a tide that could not be stopped. The first true test of their campaign came quickly. On September 20th, at a place called Fulford Gate, two English earls, Edwin of Mercia and Morcar of Northumbria, attempted to halt their advance. The clash was brutal. The English shield wall fought valiantly, but the Norse counterattacks shattered their lines. Many Englishmen drowned in the marshes as they fled. Others were cut down where they stood. It was a rout. York, the great jewel of the North, was left defenseless. The city surrendered and Hardrada's triumph seemed complete. He demanded hostages and supplies, preparing to consolidate control of the North before pushing south toward his ultimate prize, the crown of England. Yet in the glow of victory, he made a fatal miscalculation. Hardrada assumed King Harold Godwinson was still tethered in the south, his army pinned along the coast, waiting for the expected invasion from William of Normandy. Hardrada believed he had time. Time to secure York, time to rest his warriors, time to march south when he was ready. But the truth was far deadlier. For weeks, King Harold Godwinson had been watching the southern shores. His army had stood ready in full force. A living wall of shields and spears braced against a Norman fleet that never came. Then came the devastating news the North was burning. York had fallen. The armies of Edwin and Morcar had been shattered. And over England's second city now flew the Raven banner of Norway. The last great Viking had claimed the North. For most rulers, this would have been a moment for diplomacy. They would have bought time with envoys, gathered strength, and chosen their moment carefully. But Harold Godwinson was not like most kings. The betrayal was personal. Among the invaders was his own brother Tostig, who had raised his sword against crown and kin alike. The insult was too deep, the threat too great. Harold made his decision instantly. He would march north, and he would march without delay. What followed was one of the greatest feats of endurance in medieval military history. Harold gathered his elite housecarls men who fought for him, year-round hardened warriors clad in chainmail. Alongside them came the fur levies, ordinary men summoned from the shires. Farmers turned fighters. With banners lifted high and spears over their shoulders, they began their relentless march northward. From London to York is nearly 185 miles. Harold's army covered it in just 4 days. They marched like a storm across England's heartland, barely stopping to eat, barely stopping to sleep. Boots pounded the dirt roads from dawn until dusk. Rain lashed them in cold sheets, soaking their cloaks and chilling their bones. But the column never faltered. At night, they collapsed by roadside fires, rising again before dawn to push onward. Messengers galloped ahead, gathering reinforcements from villages along the way. Common folk lined the roads to watch the king's army thunder past. Thousands of armed men in tight formation, their chainmail clinking like distant thunder, their determination burning brighter than the torches that lit their night camps. Meanwhile, in the Viking camp, Harald Hardrada basked in his recent victory. He was convinced that Harold Godwinson remained in the south, watching helplessly for Norman sails that had not yet appeared. In his mind, there was no reason for urgency. The English king could not possibly reach him for weeks. He had time, or so he thought, but Harold Godwinson's march was faster than rumor itself. By the time whispers reached Hardrada that the English were on their way, the truth was already upon him. On the morning of September 25th, 1066, Hardrada's men lounged in the late summer sun near the village of Stamford Bridge. Many had left their heavy chain mail armor behind in York, thinking they faced nothing more than a routine exchange of hostages. The air was filled with the sweetness of cut grass, the gentle sound of the Derwent River, and the lazy calm of a September morning. Then on the horizon, a dust cloud rose. At first it seemed like the wind, but the earth soon trembled with the steady rhythm of boots and hooves. A scout sprinted into camp, his voice cutting through the morning stillness like a blade. The English are here! Panic erupted. Warriors scrambled to snatch up shields and axes, shouting to one another in confusion. Hardrada's booming voice tried to restore order as men rushed to the narrow wooden bridge that spanned the river. They needed time to form ranks, time for reinforcements from York to return. One man gave them that time. A towering Viking, armed with a massive Dane axe, planted himself in the middle of the bridge. Alone, he faced the English vanguard. Again and again, English warriors charged, and again his axe split shields and skulls. His defiance became legend. Some say he held the bridge for nearly an hour, his courage buying precious moments for his comrades. In the end, it was not brute strength that defeated him, but cunning. An English soldier slipped beneath the bridge, crawling along the riverbank. From below, he thrust a spear upward through the planks, striking the lone defender and ending his heroic stand. With the bridge cleared, Harold's army poured across. The English army surged across the bridge, boots pounding against the wood as if thunder itself were rolling forward. On the far bank, the Norse warriors were still scrambling to form up. Some had armor, some had none. Their chainmail left behind in York because no one had expected a fight. But even unprepared, they were Vikings veterans who had faced death on rivers, seas and battlefields from the Baltic to Byzantium. Their shield wall rose now like an iron tide, a rough patchwork of warriors, but a shield wall nonetheless. The collision came with the force of a storm. The first English ranks crashed into the Norse line, spears, bristling shields, slamming swords, cutting arcs through the hot September air. The sound was a roar of wood splintering, metal clashing, and men shouting in fury. Grass slick with sweat and blood became treacherous underfoot, and warriors grappled chest to chest, shield to shield. At the heart of the Viking host stood Harald Hardrada himself, towering above most of his men. His blue cloak streamed behind him as his great sword rose and fell, cutting down foes with sweeping strokes. To many on that field, he seemed unstoppable, the living embodiment of the old Viking sagas. Every time his sword struck, Englishmen fell. Every time his voice rang out, his warriors rallied around him. The battle dragged on under a blazing sun, the heat pressing down on armored shoulders, the sweat stinging men's eyes. The air reeked of iron sweat and churned earth. Neither side gave way. For every English push, the Vikings locked shields tighter. For every Viking counter, the English dug in deeper. But the imbalance was clear. The English were fresh from their relentless march, their numbers swelling with levies and reinforcements gathered along the way. The Norse were weary, under-armored, and scattered. Still, they fought with a ferocity born of desperation. The battle was not merely about land, it was about honor, about legacy, about the last breath of the Viking dream. Then came the moment that would echo through history. Harald Hardrada, in the thick of the fight, led a furious charge. His massive frame surged forward, sword raised high, but fate, indifferent to bravery, struck him down. An English arrow, loosed into the chaos, found the fatal gap in his armor. It pierced his throat. Hardrada staggered, clutching the wound, blood spilling down his chest. He fell to his knees, still clutching the great raven banner of Norway, before collapsing onto the battlefield. The land waster dipped toward the earth as its king drew his final breath. The last great Viking was dead. For a moment, silence seemed to ripple through the field. The Norse line, seeing their king struck down, faltered. Confusion spread like wildfire. Some men shouted in disbelief. Others pressed forward with renewed rage. In that single instant, Hardrada's army had lost not only its leader, but the very symbol of its campaign. Amid the chaos, Harold Godwinson seized his chance. Raising his voice above the din, he called out to his brother Tostig, offering mercy. "Stand down," he shouted, "and you can have your lands again. I will pardon you." It was an extraordinary offer, family ties reaching across a battlefield soaked in blood. But Tostig's answer was defiance. The years of exile, the bitterness of betrayal, the hatred that had driven him to ally with Hardrada, all of it burned too deep. He rejected his brother's mercy, and so the fighting raged on. Tostig, too, soon met his fate, cut down in the brutal crush of shield and sword. He fell where he stood, the price of revenge finally paid. With both their leaders gone, the Viking line began to crumble. What followed was slaughter. The English pressed hard their formations, tightening their resolve unbroken. Viking shields splintered their line, buckling under the relentless advance. Many Norsemen broke and fled, sprinting toward the ships anchored miles away at Rickle. But flight brought no salvation. English cavalry pursued them, cutting down the fugitives as they ran. The Derwent River itself became a grave, its waters churning with the drowned. The battlefield was littered with broken weapons, shattered shields, and the bodies of the fallen. Hours earlier, the Norse had lounged in the warm sun, laughing mending gear, playing dice. Now they lay strewn across the field, their dream of conquest extinguished. Of the mighty fleet of 300 ships that had carried Hardrada's host to England, only a fraction would be needed to take the survivors home. Chroniclers say just 24 ships sailed back across the North Sea. The rest left to rot in the rivers where they had landed. The great invasion force of Norway had been reduced to little more than a handful of survivors. The age of the Viking invasions was over. For nearly 3 centuries, Norsemen had raided, pillaged, and even ruled vast swaths of Europe. But Stamford Bridge ended it. The English victory was absolute. The Viking dream crushed once and for all. Yet victory came at a terrible price. Harold Godwinson's men were triumphant, but utterly exhausted. The forced march, the brutal hours of battle under the burning sun, the losses of friend and kin, it left them hollow-eyed and weary. The cost in blood was staggering. The English might have won the day, but they had little time to mourn or even breathe. Because as the bodies of Hardrada and Tostig lay cooling on the field, messengers arrived with dire news from the south. William, Duke of Normandy, had landed. His fleet had crossed the Channel, and his army was already establishing itself on English soil. For Harold, there would be no rest, no celebration, no time to honor the victory. The moment one threat ended, another greater, more dangerous loomed on the horizon. The king turned his weary army south once again. They had marched nearly 200 miles north in 4 days, fought one of the fiercest battles in English history. And now they would be asked to march back south, facing an enemy even more formidable than Hardrada. What lay ahead was Hastings. And so Stamford Bridge closed one chapter and opened another. The Vikings were finished. But England's fate hung by a thread. Harold Godwinson had proven his courage, his endurance, and his leadership beyond doubt. But his men were tired, their numbers thinned, and destiny was about to test them once more. The fields of Yorkshire bore silent witness to the end of one world and the beginning of another. The last Viking king lay dead, his dream buried beneath English soil. But the story was not over. The Norman sails had landed, and the future of England was about to be rewritten. The victory at Stamford Bridge should have been Harold Godwinson's crowning achievement. In a single campaign, he had annihilated one of the greatest threats ever to land on English soil. Hardrada was dead. Tostig was dead. The Viking age of conquest was finished. But history, cruel as it often is, gave Harold no time to breathe. Even as the battlefield was being cleared and the dead buried by the Derwent River messengers arrived with shattering news William of Normandy had landed on the southern coast. The long-feared invasion was no longer a looming possibility, it was reality. For weeks, Harold had stood guard on the southern shores, holding back his men in expectation of William's fleet. But once he had rushed north to crush Hardrada, the path was open. William seized it. His fleet crossed the channel, unopposed, landing at Pevensey and then Hastings. Norman horses, archers, and armored knights poured onto English soil quickly, fortifying positions and securing supplies. William had come not as a raider, but as a conqueror with every intention of seizing the English crown. The timing was devastating. Harold's army, victorious yet battered from Stamford Bridge, was now forced to march again. They had already endured nearly 400 miles in less than 2 weeks, not counting the brutal hours of combat. Now once more, Harold demanded the impossible, and yet his men followed. They marched south, leaving behind the ashes of the Viking dream and heading into the teeth of another storm. The weariness in their bodies was undeniable, but so was their loyalty. Harold had proven himself a king willing to fight at the front, to share their hardships, to bleed beside them. That bond of loyalty pulled the army forward mile after mile, toward the destiny waiting at Hastings. Meanwhile, William wasted no time. He had trained and prepared for this moment for years. The Norman army was not merely a collection of warriors, it was a professional machine. Cavalry trained to fight in disciplined charges. Archers drilled in volleys that could rain death at range. Infantry skilled in breaking formations. And above them all, William himself, a commander as ruthless as he was ambitious. The stage was set for one of the most consequential battles in European history. When Harold finally reached the south, his men were exhausted. The forced marches, the bloody clash at Stamford Bridge, and now another march of more than 200 miles had drained them to the core. Yet there was no time to rest. William's army was already entrenched, daring the English to face them. To delay meant allowing the Normans to strengthen their hold. Harold had to act. The two armies met near the town of Hastings on October 14th, in 1066. Harold took position on a ridge, his men forming the famous English shield wall. It was a formation that had carried them to victory, time and again sturdy. Disciplined, nearly impenetrable when held with resolve. On the slopes of Senlac Hill, Harold's housecarls and fyrds stood shoulder to shoulder, shields locked, spears jutting forward like the teeth of a massive beast. Below, William arranged his forces in three divisions: Bretons, Normans, and Flemish. His archers stood ready, cavalry poised for charge. The air carried the tension of a moment that would decide the future of a kingdom. The opening of the battle was like the striking of a great drum. Norman archers loosed volleys of arrows that arced high into the sky before raining down on the English line. But the shield wall held firm. Arrow after arrow clattered harmlessly off wood and iron. The English stood unbroken. Then came the cavalry. Norman knights, armored and mounted, spurred their horses up the slope. Lances lowered, banners snapping in the wind. The charge thundered forward with crushing power, but when they hit the shield wall, the English line absorbed the blow. Spears stabbed out, axes swung, and horses reeled backward, screaming as knights toppled into the dirt. Again and again, William sent his men against the English line, and again they were repelled. The shield wall, tested by Vikings for generations, stood as strong as ever. But discipline can fray, even in the strongest formation. At one point, the Norman left wing faltered, retreating down the slope in confusion. Seeing what they thought was victory, some English levies broke ranks, chasing their fleeing enemies downhill. It was the opening William had been waiting for. The retreat was a feigned tactic. As the English pursuers charged recklessly forward, Norman cavalry wheeled around, surrounding and cutting them down. What had begun as triumph became disaster. Still, the core of Harold's army held fast. His housecarls, the hardened professional warriors of England, locked shields and refused to break. Their axes rose and fell in brutal rhythm, holding back wave after wave of Norman assault. But the battle dragged on for hours. The fatigue from Stamford Bridge weighed on them, their arms aching, their ranks thinning. Slowly, the shield wall began to bend. And then came the fatal moment. As the sun sank low, Norman archers loosed another volley of arrows. One shaft, loosed high into the air, arced down through the chaos and struck Harold himself. Accounts differ. Some say it pierced his eye, others that it struck his chest, but the effect was the same. The English king fell. With Harold's death, the cohesion of the shield wall dissolved, leaderless, exhausted. and encircled the English line broke apart. Norman cavalry surged in, cutting down the last of the defenders. The ridge that had seemed so unshakable in the morning was a field of slaughter by nightfall. When the fighting ended, Harold Godwinson was dead, his brothers dead, and with them the last Saxon defense of England's crown. William of Normandy stood victorious. The consequences were immense. In the span of 3 weeks, England had faced and defeated the last great Viking invasion, only to fall to the Normans at Hastings. One king slain at Stamford Bridge, another at Senlac Hill. The Viking dream died, and with it the Anglo-Saxon kingdom that had stood for centuries. The Norman conquest began. Castles rose where none had stood before. The language, the culture, the very identity of England was transformed. It was the dawn of a new order, born from the exhaustion of Harold's army and the relentless ambition of William. Looking back, the chain of events feels almost cruel in its inevitability. Harold had achieved the impossible at Stamford Bridge, crushing Hardrada and ending an era. But that very triumph left him vulnerable. His men drained his strength sapped. The march south was heroic, but it was also fatal. Fate had demanded too much from him in too little time. And so 1066 became a year remembered not for one battle, but for 3: Fulford, Stamford Bridge, and Hastings. Each linked to the other, each shaping the destiny of England. In the north, the Viking Age ended. In the south, Anglo-Saxon England fell. And in the middle of it all stood Harold Godwinson, a king who gave everything for his realm, only to lose it in the end. The fields of Yorkshire and Sussex became graves, not only for men, but for entire eras. One age closed and another opened. The saga of Stamford Bridge and Hastings reminds us that history is not kind to the weary, nor merciful to the brave. It rewards timing, preparation, and the cruel hand of fate. And that autumn of 1066, fate chose William.